Stanford University.
Welcome to Stanford Medicine's 10th Annual Contemplation by Design Summit. I'm Dr. Tia Ridge, founder and director of Contemplation by Design. We are so happy you are here, creating our community together for this practice and wisdom transmission period. It is my honor to introduce our speaker, Mei Elliott, who will be speaking to us about the Bodhisattva with boundaries, the paradox of selflessness and self-care. Mei Elliott is a Dharma teacher in the Theravada Buddhist tradition who practices at the intersection between Zen and Vipassana. Mei began training as a Zen monk at Tassajara Zen Mountain Center in 2014 and has been living at Zen temples ever since. She most recently served as the director of San Francisco Zen Center and was previously the guiding instructor for Young Urban Zen at the San Francisco Center. Mei currently teaches at a variety of insight meditation centers on the West Coast. Join me now in warmly welcoming Mei Elliott.
Thank you so much, Tia. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'd like to begin by sharing what the Dalai Lama recites every morning when he wakes up. So he begins his day of practice with a poetic rendition of one of Shantideva's verses. And this is how it goes. May I be a guard for those who need protection, a guide for those on the path, a boat, a raft, a bridge for those to cross the flood. May I be a lamp in the darkness, a resting place for the weary, and a healing medicine for all who are sick. For as long as earth and sky endure, may I assist until all living beings are awakened. So this is the prayer of the Bodhisattva. And if you're not familiar with the term Bodhisattva, Bodhisattva is a being that's dedicated to the awakening of others. That is to say, they're dedicated to the eradication of suffering for all beings. And traditionally, the Bodhisattva lets go of their limited sense of self and instead prioritizes the well-being of others as the greatest act of complete compassion. So we see this attitude of selfless service in the great teachers of all traditions, from early history to the modern day. We see it in Jesus, in the Buddha, Mother Teresa, Thich Nhat Hanh, Pope Francis, Dipa Ma, and the list goes on, of course. We see it in the way, we see this selfless generosity in the way that Mahatma Gandhi fasted for peace, in the way that Mother Teresa washed the wounds of lepers. The last thing I was sharing was about Patrul Rinpoche, who would go into the forest and lie down in areas where there were swarms of horseflies, allowing them to feed on him, basically. He'd turn completely black, covered in horseflies, hang out there for a few hours, and then say, oh, okay, time to go. And so this was his expression of Bodhisattva activity, of saving all beings, engaging in this very radical act of selfless giving. So some of the masters that I just shared about are amongst the most admired and most inspiring people who have ever walked the earth. And again, they exhibit this capacity to let go of their fixed, limited sense of self and instead prioritize the well-being of others, whether that's supporting the well-being of an insect or supporting the well-being of a nation. And while, of course, some of the examples I just gave are rather extreme, generally speaking, stories of radical generosity can really inspire us. They can inspire us to put our self-obsession aside and instead be of service to others. And this ultimately calls forth a more meaningful and reliable source of happiness in our life. And however, while these stories can be inspiring, at times they can also be confusing, particularly for spiritual practitioners who aspire to practice radical generosity on one hand, but who on the other hand keep hearing from their therapists something along the lines of like, hey, you should really work on having healthy boundaries. So it can be confusing, right? I just recently read an article called The 9 Signs of Unhealthy Boundaries. And I won't read all of them to you, but one of the 9 was behaving strictly in the service of others. And another one was a lost sense of self. And these are signs of unhealthy boundaries. Doesn't that sound a little like what Mother Teresa and the Dalai Lama were up to? So modern psychology stresses again and again the importance of developing a mature, confident, stable sense of self. So does that mean if we want to be devoted spiritual practitioners and aspire to become like the great masters, that we should have poor boundaries and an unhealthy sense of self? So this is exactly what we'll be exploring in the talk together today. So how is it that we can reconcile spiritual teachings that seem to be pointing to a radical, selfless generosity with modern psychology's dictum that healthy boundaries are essential? You know, one sounds like we should give and give and give with no regard to the self, and the other seems to be saying the opposite. Are teachings of modern psychology in conflict with the spiritual path? Both are designed to lead to happiness. So which is right? And what exactly to make of this paradox? So these questions, this paradox is at the heart of what we'll be exploring in today's lecture. My intention is that this talk will explain how healthy boundaries actually do fit in with spiritual teachings on selfless generosity. The apparent contradiction can actually be reconciled, and we'll do that primarily by looking at the Mahayana Buddhist teaching on the 2 truths. While our primary question is about how to reconcile teachings on selfless generosity with those on healthy boundaries, in order to do that, we actually need to explore an even more central paradox. And that is, how do we reconcile teachings on selflessness with a mature, healthy sense of self? So much of my talk today will be about that central paradox, selflessness versus mature self. That's really the core paradox. And I should pause at this point to acknowledge that my background's in Buddhism, so that's the spiritual tradition that I'll be speaking from. And because I come from dual lineages, I'll be weaving together teachers from both the Theravada and the Mahayana that speak to this theme. Okay, so I now want to just spend a little time highlighting the relevance of this topic and why is it important. So there's actually a good reason for reconciling this paradox between not self and healthy self, this paradox between selfless generosity and healthy boundaries. And that's because when it's not considered, when it's not reconciled, it can lead to a lot of suffering. So let's look at some case examples. These examples are courtesy of the Insight teacher and author Philip Moffitt, who tells a story about working with some of his own students around boundaries and the ensuing confusion on the topic. So here's what he writes. Sophie is a professional woman in her mid-30s. She attends a weekly mindfulness meditation class where she expresses that she feels repeatedly taken advantage of. After listening to her describe a painful episode in which a friend had acted inappropriately during a visit, I told her, "You need to work on improving your emotional boundaries." She was surprised by this comment, replying, "But the teachings of the Buddha say we aren't separate. So why would I need boundaries? What am I protecting? Isn't the whole idea not to be attached to the needs of my ego?" This then prompted Russell, another student, to reveal that he and his ex-wife, who shared custody of their child, were working on boundary issues with a counselor. We never worked this out while married, he said. We thought being in love meant you weren't supposed to have boundaries. So it's really quite common for spiritual practitioners to unconsciously misinterpret the teachings on selflessness, the teachings on oneness, on non-separation, thinking that these teachings should mean that we shouldn't have boundaries, or people override their own well-being, or ignore their emotional needs, or they ignore important developmental tasks under the guise of noble, selfless service. And I stress that it's done unconsciously because many spiritual practitioners aren't aware that they're doing this, which is one of the reasons that I'm drawing attention to this pattern in my talk. And I share this because I know personally what it's like to negate boundaries in the name of Bodhisattva activity. In the vein of spiritual sort of generosity. So I'd like to share a little bit about my background. As Tia mentioned, I'm a Buddhist teacher in the Theravada tradition. However, I've spent the last 9 years living in Zen temples and monasteries, training as a Zen monk, learning to let go of the ego, and as they say, to burn oneself up in the act of selfless service. So when you begin training as a Zen monk, one of the first teachings you might receive is the Zen maxim, say yes, just say yes. And this famous line by Suzuki Roshi, the founder of San Francisco Zen Center, can function in a way to undercut the mental pattern of resistance that keeps us in conflict with our lives. Rather than reject or resist our circumstances, can we just say yes to things as they are? So here's Suzuki Roshi's quote in full. So the secret is just to say yes and jump off from there. And jump off from here. You forget all about yourself and are refreshed. You are a new self, and before that self becomes an old self, you say yes. So this is a very skillful teaching and a wonderful teaching, and yet you might sense how the practice of just saying yes could easily lead to being overworked and underslept and depleted. I lived at Tassajara Zen Monastery for about 2.5 years, and just Tassajara is a secluded mountain monastery in the Ventana wilderness. And at the time, there was no internet and no cell phones, no email, just a whole lot of meditating and working to support the monastic schedule. At Tassajara, the wake-up bell was at 3:45 a.m. At 3:45, we'd throw on our monastic robes, and those of us who were in charge of running the meditation hall would start work at 4 a.m. And then we'd finish at about 9:30 p.m. It ended up being about a 17-hour day of ceremonial work with no breaks, no time off. And we would just keep saying yes to ringing bells and cleaning altars and performing ceremonies and basically keeping the monastery going. And it really was fantastic practice for shedding the sense of self. It was truly transformative in a beautiful way. However, as you can tell, this style of practice was quite rigorous. And as someone with chronic health issues, I wasn't taking care of my health in the way that I really needed to. And ultimately, I was prioritizing the monastery above myself and was in very poor health while practicing in that way. So fortunately, it wasn't long before I learned that the practice of saying yes was actually more balanced than I had realized. After thoroughly learning how to say yes in my training, it came time for me to learn the secret teaching. Once you learn how to say yes, then you must learn how to say no. Mel Weitzman, who is the co-founder and abbot of Berkeley Zen Center for decades and the co-abbot of San Francisco Zen Center. He was one of the most influential teachers in the formation of Soto Zen in California with something like 30 Dharma errors. And he really made himself into an instrument of generosity and kindness. And if anyone knew how to say yes, Mel knew how to say yes. And yet I like to remember this story about him. As the story goes, one of Mel's students had a dream in the middle of the night. And it was such a powerful dream. And he was so compelled by it that he actually drove to Berkeley Zen Center in the middle of the night to knock on Mel's door and tell him about it. So the man knocks on the door, and it must have been loud enough to wake Mel up, because Mel goes and he answers the door. And the man says, "Mel, you have got to hear about this dream I just had." And Mel takes one look at him, and without hesitation, he says, "No, I don't." And he closes the door. So here's someone who is so kind, so deeply trained in saying yes to whatever arises, who has also learned how to say no. So continuing now with my time at SF Zen Center, if you stick around Zen Center long enough, and if you're a very bad monk, eventually they punish you by making you director. So after many years of practice, I became the director of SFZC, and specifically their city center temple. And the position was somewhat notorious. San Francisco Zen Center is the largest Zen institution in North America. And as the director of one of the temples, one is really on call at all hours, responding to fires and floods and criminal break-ins and any number of other emergencies. The role is responsible for managing the employment, the housing, the food, safety, and community life of all the residents. One is in back-to-back meetings from dawn until dusk, with a fresh email coming in about every 5 minutes or so. So clearly there are more requests than one can possibly respond to. And I should pause here to mention that by nature, I want to say yes to everyone. I want to accept every application for residency. I want to offer praise, not criticism. But I also knew by this time that doing so really wouldn't serve anyone and would really only be what Pema Chodron calls idiot compassion. So instead, I made myself a motivational plaque. And when I say motivational plaque, you may remember them from Sky Mall catalogs on airplanes. I remember these little magazines, they'd have all of these really dramatic motivational plaques for sale in them. Like there might be one with an eagle on it, an eagle poster. And the subheading would be something like excellence, dare to soar, or something like that. So after training and saying yes for a very long time, I made myself a little motivational plaque for my desk. And it was very modest. It didn't have any eagles on it. All it said was, "No, I'm sorry, that can't happen." That was my inspirational quote, my mantra. "No, I'm sorry, that can't happen." And though I still said yes when it was wise to, this reminded me every day that it was actually okay to also say no. Meanwhile, as part of my Zen training, I participated in many ceremonies with much bowing and chanting, and I literally chanted hundreds and hundreds of times, "Beings are numberless, I vow to save them." So here I was, training in selfless service, aspiring to be as generous as the Buddha, and vowing to save all beings from suffering. And yet my teachers were instructing me to set boundaries, to say no, and making motivational plaques that remind me to say, "No, I'm sorry, that can't happen." So how to make sense of this? Well, this gets us back to our primary question, how to reconcile teachings on selfless generosity with healthy boundaries, how to make sense of this paradox between selflessness and mature, healthy sense of self. So this is where I'd like to introduce the teaching on the two truths. And this teaching was articulated by the Buddhist monk and philosopher Nagarjuna, the founder of the Madhyamaka school. And I'll try to offer a straightforward version of the two truths as they're typically presented in Western Soto Zen. And for all of you Nagarjuna scholars out there, I'm sorry, but this won't be a comprehensive commentary or historical analysis of the two truths. I'm really aiming for accessibility. And to contextualize the importance of the two truths, I want to point to the Heart Sutra. The Heart Sutra is the most famous Mahayana sutra. It's the most frequently copied, recited, and studied sutra in the entire Mahayana. And of all the Zen liturgy, this is the sutra that we chant most frequently at San Francisco Zen Center. You can kind of think of it as the top pop song amongst Zen monks. If we were to zoom in on the thesis of the Heart Sutra, it's this: form is emptiness, emptiness is form. To explore the two truths today, I'll be using the term form to explore the relative or conventional truth, the first truth, and I'll be using the term emptiness to explore the ultimate or universal truth. Okay, so let's start with the first truth. Form refers to conventional reality. This is the truth that describes our daily experience of the concrete world. It describes our normal experience of daily life. So from the relative perspective, the perspective of form, there are people, places, things, and everything we can imagine. This includes you, it includes me, it includes love and anger, Oklahoma, pickleball, the teachings of the Buddha, gravity, beanie babies. Every idea, name, and object is recognized from the perspective of form. This is the relative truth. It points to the world that can be named and thought about. We might, and specifically, we know it through concepts. It can be named and thought about. So we might call it the conceptual truth. We can all see and experience the relative truth. And from the perspective of form, we should all develop a mature, stable, confident, healthy sense of self. The other truth is the empty nature of phenomena. That is to say, it points to emptiness. Unrest can be quite difficult to speak about and even harder to see. And especially if this is the first time that you're hearing teachings, please don't worry if it feels a little inaccessible. Making sense of emptiness teachings can take a while. So if you find yourself confused, instead of listening for an intellectual grasp, maybe just try listening for feelings of resonance. So emptiness, or shunyata in Sanskrit, refers to how all things lack solid, unchanging, independent identities. There's no fixed essence or unchanging core to ourselves or to anything in our experience. We could say all things lack a fixed identity. This applies to our personal self, to others, and to all objects. We have names and labels for things, but there's nothing fixed beneath them. All objects are always changing. Put another way, maybe more simply, when you hear the word emptiness, you can think empty of what? Empty of separate self. From the view of form, our concepts are carving up the universe into distinct identities, like you and me, and redwood trees, and war, and legislation, and tuxedos, all of the things. From the perspective of form, these concepts reify things, making it seem as though that they're unchanging, making it seem like they really have a fixed identity. I wanted to zoom in on the teachings on the emptiness of self. So our standard view of ourselves is that I am a specific individual that's in control of my experience, and this self persists through time. There's a continuous me moving through time and space. However, when we investigate a little more closely, we see that there isn't a solid, permanent, stable thing that we can call I, me, or mine. What we call ourself is actually much more amorphous than we think and much more difficult to pin down. So let's explore this by taking a look at what we typically identify with. So often we identify with our emotions, or our physical form, or our thoughts. So let's start with emotions. Well, our emotions are impermanent. In the midst of feeling them, often they feel so real, so intense. But boy, do they come and go, right? They move through like clouds in an empty sky. So to identify with an emotion is kind of like putting a stake in a cloud and claiming it as property, right? So of course, we're not really our emotions. Well, then, are we our physical form? Am I my body, my arms, my legs, skin, etc.? So here's a little macabre thought experiment for you. If your leg was removed, would you still be you? Well, probably. You'd probably say, yeah, I'm still me. What about if your eyes or ears or nose were removed? Would you still be you? Oh, yeah, well, it wouldn't be receiving the same sense impressions, but probably still be me. But what about a heart transplant? Is somebody still them if they have a heart transplant? Yeah. Well, and here's the tricky one. What about your brain? Many of us identify with the witness that's behind the eyes, kind of this sense of existing in the brain, and looking out on the world from the control tower. So I'd like to read you a quote. After more than a century of looking for it, brain researchers have long since concluded that there is no conceivable place for a self to be located in the physical brain, and that it simply does not exist. Time Magazine, 2002. Well then, if we aren't our brain, could we be our thoughts? Well, I sure hope not. Anyone who spent any time meditating likely knows that thoughts can be so neurotic and so obsessive. So I sure hope we're not our thoughts. And of course, I know that we're not our thoughts. A thought, it really is it's just like a weightless hologram. Thoughts are just words and pictures in our minds. They're like the most insubstantial of all. And it can actually be incredibly liberating to realize that we're not our thoughts. So if you're not your emotions, and you're not your thoughts, and you're not your body, well, where are you exactly? Where is the you-ness of you? And what we find is that there's no fixed you at the core. From the perspective of form, the relative truth, it's conventionally useful to call this physical mass Mei Elliot. But when we engage in reflections like this one, that point towards emptiness, we can begin to reveal the empty nature of the sense of self. Another inroad to understanding emptiness is seeing the impermanence of all things. And we can do that by using the analogy of a river. And this analogy comes from the book Emptiness by the Insight teacher, Guy Armstrong. Okay, so in our analogy of a river, from the view of form, the relative truth, streams and rivers have their own unique nature. Some are wide, some are slow and cloudy, some are fast and clear. They have specific geographic locations, and they can be named and designated in meaningful ways. Like we need to know the difference between the Mississippi River and the Rogue River and the Sacramento River. This is useful and relevant information. From the view of emptiness, the universal truth, we can begin to see the insubstantiality, the emptiness of a river. And here's how. Each river has banks which have some semblance of continuity in that they inhabit certain geographic locations. And yet the water itself is always changing. As they say, you can't step in the same river twice. There's actually nothing fixed there. There's nothing fixed in the river. If you were to take a bucket to a river and scoop up some water, then bring that bucket to your friends, and if you said something like, hey, look, it's the Mississippi River, they'd probably look at you like you're crazy. They'd be like, no, that's actually just a bucket of water. It's because we can't grasp onto anything specific. We can't grasp onto any specific aspect of the river and say, that's the Mississippi, because it's always changing. We humans are like rivers. There's the Mei Elliott River and the Joe Biden River and the Stephen King River, and all beings. And conventionally, from the viewpoint of form, like I said, these are useful and important designations. There is something here called Mei Elliott with memories, plans, fears, stories, and preferences. I'd like to read you this quote by Suzuki Roshi. He says, "Of course the bird we see and hear exists. It exists, but what I mean by that may not be exactly what you mean. Of course the bird we see and hear exists. It exists, but what I mean by that may not be exactly what you mean." So from emptiness, even though we think there's a permanent fixed me in here, we're always changing. Like the river, there's nothing we can point to that's fixed. We're not a solid, stable identity so much as a process. The water flowing past is a lot like the mind stream, the waterfall of thoughts, of emotions, of physical sensations, always changing. And we start to see this in meditation. We can begin to see the empty nature of things by staying present to the flow. As soon as we say, this is me, or this is mine, we're fixating on a certain data point within the flow of experience. And this is like going to the river and taking out a bucket of water. And we do this when we say, I'm not very smart, or we say, my coworker's lazy, or my siblings are stingy. We're fixating on certain moments of experience and creating an identity out of it for ourselves or someone else. We're pointing to something that's actually already passed. It's like taking a bucket to the river, right? Scooping out some water and saying, this is you. This is how you are. This is me. This is how I am. So you might consider, what data points do you choose to focus on? And how are you congealing a sense of identity? How are you creating something fixed out of something that's actually fluid? Our entire conceptual world is based on dipping our bucket in the river. To summarize so far, I've talked about the two truths, the truth of form, the relative truth, a description of our everyday life, a description of the world of ideas and things where everything is differentiated by concepts. And the conceptual truth. And then the other truth, the truth of emptiness, the ultimate, the universal truth. And remember, for shorthand, when you hear emptiness, you can think empty of what? Empty of separate self. Emptiness says there's nothing fixed, there's no core, unchanging essence to ourselves or to phenomena below our layer of concepts. So let's go back to the Heart Sutra now. You may recall that the thesis of the Heart Sutra is form is emptiness and emptiness is form. And it's really important that we understand that the two truths aren't pointing to separate things. So that's what I want to talk about next. How is it that form is emptiness and emptiness is form? So if I hold up my hand like this, you might see it as a hand, and yet you might also see it as 5 fingers. One hand is 5 fingers, and there's no hand beyond the 5 fingers. 5 fingers and one hand are the same thing, 2 aspects of one reality. And within this collection of 5 fingers, each finger is different and even has a different name. You know, there might be like the Mei Elliott finger and the Beyonce finger and earthquakes and Sundays and resentment, and, you know, the whole phenomenal world. Or we can change our focus and just see the hand, where there's no distinction, no separation, just one hand. From the lens of form, we see the unique identity of each finger. From the lens of emptiness, we see the whole hand, no separation. Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. Now remember, the reason I'm explaining the two truths is to help us reconcile the Buddhist teachings on selflessness with the basic tenet of psychology that says we need to have a mature sense of self. And as part of that, how can we reconcile teachings on selfless generosity with the teachings that healthy boundaries are essential? So now I'd like to bring this all together. What does form and emptiness have to do with this paradox? Well, from the perspective of form, people are unique individuals with different haircuts and beliefs, cultural backgrounds, and personal histories. From the perspective of form, from the perspective of the relative truth, this is true and worth honoring. Looking at the two truths, it's the perspective that aligns with the need to have a healthy sense of self. So this aligns really well with modern psychology's suggestion that we develop a mature sense of self with healthy boundaries. So this is where spiritual teachings align with psychology. Buddhism says, honor form, take care of form. And from this perspective, we can nurture and love ourselves. Strictly speaking, as the insight teacher Sally Armstrong says, Buddha didn't say there's no self. We want a healthy sense of self, but we want to remember the conventional nature of this self. This self doesn't exist in the way we think it does. Sounds kind of like Suzuki Roshi, right? So it's from the other perspective of emptiness, the universal truth, that we see that there isn't a separate fixed entity called me. We see that we're actually just rivers of experience. And for those who have deeply realized emptiness, like the Dalai Lama and Patrul Rinpoche, it becomes possible to engage in radical acts of selfless generosity. So it's from the perspective of emptiness where we see realized masters engaging in acts of selfless service. So these two truths hold the paradox of selflessness and a healthy sense of self. Because form is emptiness and emptiness is form, we can start to see how teachings on not self and boundaries can coexist. We can begin to reconcile the paradox. And here's a critical aspect of form and emptiness teachings. We must respect both to be free of suffering, okay? We need to honor the conventional. We need to honor form. We're not using emptiness teachings to deny the singular, wonderful, unique creation called you. We're not denying our experience in any way, but by seeing its emptiness, we're just not identifying with it. Anab Thupten, the Tibetan Buddhist teacher, says, I love myself. It's so dear. It shows up and tells me what clothes to put on in the morning and what to eat. It's so helpful. The persona becomes like a garment that we wear because it's useful, just like we wear clothes. But we don't identify with our clothes. We need a persona just how we need clothes. I stress how important it is to honor form. I really stress this because it's by favoring emptiness that spiritual practitioners end up with unhealthy boundaries. They typically don't have healthy boundaries because they've heard teachings on not self, on emptiness, and teachings on radical generosity. For example, they hear about the Bodhisattva vow to save all beings, and they think they're supposed to give and give and give and deny their own well-being. But of course, this perspective misunderstands the importance of honoring form. As Gil Fronsdal says, the ultimate does not deny the conventional. In other words, teachings on emptiness don't negate the importance of form. Teachings on emptiness don't negate the importance of taking care of our individual sense of self. In classical Zen teachings, if a student goes to a Zen master and says, the self is but a dream, the Zen master might hit the student with a stick and say, well, is that self a dream? In essence, the Zen master is like, so if the self is but a dream, then that stick to the head's a dream too, right? Put another way, saying the self is but a dream is a little bit like going to the Zen master and saying, because of emptiness, there's no self, so there's no need for healthy boundaries. At which point the master hits the student with a stick and says, since there's no self and no boundaries, that stick didn't hurt, right? It's the same thing. So yes, things are empty, but it's a wrong view to think that emptiness negates form or renders form invisible. That stick still hurts. This is, awakening the student to realize that the realm of form is real and it is not excused or negated or ignored because of emptiness. If we negate or ignore form, it may be spiritual bypassing. So spiritual bypassing is a term that was coined by the psychotherapist John Welwood, and he defines spiritual bypassing like this. He says, spiritual bypassing is the tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. For example, so saying, I don't need boundaries because everything is empty is a type of spiritual bypassing. Other examples of spiritual bypassing might be repressing or denying difficult feelings because they're not spiritual. This often happens for spiritual practitioners around anger. It's common for them to bury their anger rather than working through it, thinking that this is not a spiritual emotion. It's also spiritual bypassing to act unethically on the grounds that everything is empty, or to not respond to situations that actually really require a response. For example, say I was being verbally or physically abused by my supervisor at work, and my response was, well, we're all empty, so I'm not going to say or do anything about it. That would be spiritual bypassing. Emptiness doesn't negate our actual experience. There's some Leonard Cohen lyrics that speak to this. I know the burden's heavy as you wheel it through the night. The guru says it's empty, but that doesn't mean it's light. Emptiness doesn't lead to a sense of negligence or futility. It's deeply connected. And from this place, it's deeply ethical. We respect ethics. We don't harm other beings. We don't steal or lie or kill because we so deeply respect form. That is, we so deeply respect the individual experience and know what it's like to be harmed. Padmasambhava, from the 9th century, who was credited with founding the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism, said, though my view is as vast as space, my attention to conduct is as fine as barley flour. In short, though my view is as vast as emptiness, my attention to conduct, my attention to form is as fine as barley flour. So we need to hold both form and emptiness at once. So from the view of form, we take very good care of ourselves. When we consider the Bodhisattva vow to be devoted to the welfare of all beings, we need to include ourselves. You are one of those beings, right? We're not saving all beings, excluding ourselves. We are equally devoted to including ourselves in that circle of care. There's a story about Sharon Salzberg as a young woman practicing in India. And Sharon is one of the founders of Vipassana in the West, a teacher and prolific author. But before any of that, she was in India practicing loving kindness meditation for months on end and working with the wise and compassionate teacher Munindra. So one night she was riding in a rickshaw in Calcutta with a friend, traveling through many dark streets and alleyways. And out of nowhere, a large man jumped at the rickshaw. He grabbed Sharon and tried to pull her out. And of course, she was terrified, imagining what he might do to her. But fortunately, before long, her friend was able to push him off and they were able to continue on their way. So later, when she recounted this story to Munindra, he said, "Oh, Sharon, with all the loving kindness in your heart, you should have taken your umbrella and hit that man over the head with it." So as Munindra demonstrated, the instruction to protect all beings means that sometimes we also need to protect ourselves. We need to include ourselves as one of the beings that we are devoted to. And of course, in most settings, drawing a boundary doesn't involve needing to enact physical self-defense. Often it simply involves changing our proximity to a person or a situation or spending less time with them. And we can do that in a skillful way. The author and freedom worker, Jaya John, says, your boundary need not be an angry electric fence that shocks those who touch it. It can be a consistent light around you that announces, I will be treated sacredly. So how can your boundary be a light that announces, I will be treated sacredly? A common question I receive from students is something along the lines of, I have a difficult family member or a friend that I don't want to shut out, but it feels really harmful for me to be around them. So what do I do? So in these situations, how can we hold form and emptiness? How can we bring in selfless generosity while still being boundaried? So sometimes I think of these difficult family members or friends as a little like tigers. If we get in the cage with them, we'll be eaten alive. But we also don't want to abandon our tiger. And the key is realizing that there are other ways to feed a tiger without being harmed by them. If you get inside the cage, you might become tiger food. And we don't want to be eaten alive by the difficult people in our lives. So it can be helpful to remember that you don't need to get in the cage with a tiger in order to feed it. It's possible to push the food into the cage with a long stick, right? So depending on how difficult or threatening your tiger is, you might use a 3-foot stick, or you might use a 10-foot stick, or maybe you need a 50-foot stick. Often we can keep a difficult person in our life as long as we have enough physical space from them and enough time away from them. Growing up, my father was an alcoholic who I loved dearly, and I actually had a very beautiful relationship with. But I learned after a long time that if he was drinking, I couldn't spend time with him. And there were times where he had been sober for a few months, so I might make plans to go see him for Christmas or Thanksgiving, and I would arrange my life to go on vacation, get time off work, pack my bags, and start driving down to see him in Southern California. And I might be a few hours on the road and get a call from him where he was clearly drunk on the phone. And in that situation, I would turn the car around because I couldn't get in the cage with the tiger. I knew I would be eaten alive. So the problem in my situation was that my dad was drinking a lot, and I didn't want to spend years of our relationship out of contact. So what I learned was that I could maintain contact by having an occasional phone call. So my way of feeding the tiger was having a call. And that's the stick I used for pushing food into the cage. For you, maybe a phone call with a person is too much. Maybe sending a postcard is the type of stick you need. Or maybe you don't have any sort of contact in that way, but you provide some unspoken financial support. There are many ways to feed a tiger. You just need to find the right stick for it. So, yeah, in short, can you find the distance at which you can be with this difficult being with an open heart? That's what it comes down to. What boundary or distance or time do you need to be with this person in a way that allows you to still have an open heart? I also want to acknowledge that with some difficult people, it doesn't work to have any contact with them. There really is not a stick long enough to make it safe to feed that tiger. And in many situations, the most wise and compassionate action is to close someone out of our life completely. But when we do, we learn that we don't need to shut them out of our heart. Okay, so thus far, I've touted the importance of boundaries, even for those on the spiritual path. And yet we still occasionally see these examples of great spiritual teachers enacting radical selfless generosity, where it doesn't seem like they have any boundaries whatsoever. As I mentioned earlier, we see this in the way Gandhi fasted for peace, or in the way Mother Teresa cleaned the wounds of lepers, or Patrul Rinpoche becoming fly food. So if boundaries are important, if honoring emptiness and form is important, how do we make sense of these stories? Is there a situation where radical acts like this are actually appropriate? Or are we to look at Mother Teresa and say, well, she didn't have good boundaries, or, oh, she was spiritually bypassing? So I want to take a few minutes to see if we can make sense of these rare acts of truly selfless giving. And this is how I might answer that question about whether there's actually a time or a situation where it is appropriate to give in this way. So I would say our necessity for boundaries depends on the depth to which we've realized emptiness. Our necessity for boundaries depends on the depth to which we've realized emptiness. And here's what I mean by that. Of the two truths, we can all experience the relative truth of form, but most of us have limited insight into the ultimate truth of emptiness, the truth of selflessness. So to fully realize emptiness is to fully realize that there's no fixed separate self. So it may be that deeply realized masters who have fully realized emptiness don't always need to be as boundaried as your average Joe. That they actually have more capacity to give. Because when one has fully realized the absence of self, they truly understand that there's no self that needs to be protected. As the poet Myung-Mi Kim says, to a body of infinite size, there can be ascribed neither center nor boundary. To a body of infinite size, there can be ascribed neither center nor boundary. But until we fully realize emptiness, until we fully realize that there's no separate self, until then, we're still identified with the self. As long as we're still identified with the self, that self's boundaries need to be respected. So that's why I say the necessity of boundaries depends on the extent to which we fully realize our own emptiness. And this isn't just realizing our own emptiness cognitively, like, oh yeah, that makes sense, there's no fixed self. Full realization of emptiness is a deep and transformational, non-conceptual insight. We all need to take care of the conventional self. But for the masters who have fully realized an emptiness, who have had that transformational insight, they might not need to do it in the same way as those of us who haven't yet fully realized selflessness. For those of us who haven't fully realized it, 99.99999, etc. % of beings, we need to take greater care with having boundaries. As the psychologist and Vipassana practitioner Jack Engler said, you have to be a somebody before you can be a nobody. And to help elucidate this, I'd like to share the traditional story of the poisoned tree. And this story, it's usually used to explain how to meet obstacles on the spiritual path. But I think it really serves well this situation too. And I learned this story from Jack Kornfield. So on first discovering a poisoned tree, many people only see that it's dangerous. Their first reaction is, let's cut down this tree so nobody gets hurt. Let's cut it down before anybody eats the poison fruit. And this is the primary reaction one might have when encountering a difficult person or a difficult situation in their life. Their first response is to cut that person out or that situation out, saying, this person causes harm, I need to get rid of them. I need to cut them out of my life. And sometimes this is the most skillful thing we have capacity for. It's a very well-meaning boundary, but it is often fueled by aversion or judgment or fear. So Jack Kornfield says, continuing the story, other people who have journeyed further along the spiritual path discover this poison tree and do not meet it with aversion. They have realized that to open to life requires a deep and heartfelt compassion for all that is around us. Knowing the poison tree is somehow a part of us, they say, let us not cut it down. Instead, let's have compassion for the tree as well. So out of kindness, they build a fence around the tree so that others may not be poisoned and the tree may also have its life. This second approach shows a profound shift of relationship from judgment and fear to compassion. So this is the second way of meeting the poison tree. And this is a great example of a compassionate boundary. We have enough understanding of emptiness to see that this tree is in some way a part of us, but we realize that it causes harm. So we create a boundary. We build a fence around the tree. This is the sort of boundary I've been suggesting again and again in this talk. It's the sort of boundary that my teachers recommended to me when I was director. And it's the sort of boundary I recommend to students who are trying to make peace with the hungry tigers in their life. This is a boundary that balances an understanding of form and emptiness beautifully. Poison tree, let's care for the tree. Let's not chop it down, but let's put a fence around it. But then Jack continues. He says, there is also a third type of person, a being who has traveled yet deeper in spiritual life sees the same tree. This person who has gained much vision looks and says, "Oh, a poison tree. Perfect. Just what I was looking for." This individual picks the poison fruit, investigates its properties, mixes with other ingredients, and uses the poison as a great medicine to heal the sick and transform the ills of the world. So this last type of being, a being that could pick the fruit and turn it into medicine to drink, might be a being who has fully realized emptiness, a being who has fully realized selflessness, who sees that they're empty. This sort of being might be a great master who still honors the realm of form, but who knows that they don't need to protect themselves from the poison tree because they understand completely that there's no one left to protect. So in this way, we see great masters who can at times engage in radical, selfless acts of generosity, who can drink the juice from the poisoned fruit and make medicine for the world. So in conclusion, I'd like to tell you about one of the Buddha mudras. A mudra is a hand gesture, sometimes called a seal, which is often used in spiritual practice. They're very common in Hinduism and Buddhism. And there are many, many different mudras, each representing different things and having different purposes. Perhaps the mudra that people are most familiar with is Jhana mudra, where the thumb tip and index finger are touching like this or like this. And this mudra is often associated with wisdom or knowledge. The mudra that I'd like to mention is a lesser known mudra called Abhaya mudra, one where the hand is flat like a piece of paper, where the fingers are together pointing upwards and the palm is flat, so it's like this. So this mudra represents the gift of fearlessness. In short, this mudra represents a form of generosity. So if I were to extrapolate a bit, we could think of this mudra as representative of selfless generosity, of boundless giving. Interestingly enough, this hand gesture in Western culture has a very different meaning. In Western culture, this hand gesture means stop. It's a gesture expressing a fundamental boundary, stop or no. So which is it? Is the mudra about selfless generosity? Or is it about setting a boundary? Maybe it's both. Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. Teachings on form tell us that we need to tend to our boundaries and care for the unique individual called me. Teachings on emptiness tell us that we aren't only an individual me, but that below the idea of me, below the concept of me, I'm actually an ever-changing river. And the more deeply I can see that I'm always changing, the more deeply I can see that there's no static self at the core, the less tightly I need to cling to a fixed sense of self. The more deeply I can realize emptiness, the less I cling to a sense of I, me, and mine. The more deeply I can realize this, the more deeply I understand the emptiness of myself, the more freedom I have in giving. The greater my capacity is for selfless generosity. And all the while, we respect both. We honor form and emptiness all along the way. So I'll end with a poem. And as I read it, listen for which side of the leaf is form and which is emptiness. And the poem's called I Was Reading a Poem by David Rushman. I was reading a poem by Ryokan about a leaf and how it showed the front and the back as it fell. And I wanted to call someone, my wife, my brother, to tell about the poem. And I thought that maybe my telling about the poem was the front of the leaf, and my silence about the poem was the back. And then I thought that maybe my telling and my silence together were honestly just the front of the leaf, and that the back was something else, something I didn't understand. And then I thought that maybe everything I understood and everything I didn't were both actually just the front of the leaf. So that the totality of my life was actually just the front of the leaf, just the one side, which would make the other side my death. Unless my life and death together were really still only the front of the leaf. I had left the branch. I was falling. I was loose now in the bright autumn air. Thank you so much for your kind attention. It's been a pleasure sharing with you.
Thank you, Mei, very much for your wisdom and your generosity and your caring for yourself.
Thank you, Tia. Thank you, everyone. Take care. I'll see you soon for those who want to do the guided meditation.